one of the most influential people by Time Magazine, the top 100, and one of foreign policy's top global thinkers. Malcolm is joining us again on this show. How are you today?
I'm really good. How are you doing?
Great. You've got an episode of your podcast. It is a tremendous podcast called Revisionist History, and you did a fascinating episode on Wilt Chamberlain and how he briefly shot underhanded free throws, but then he switched back even though he was better underhanded. So why? You're good at answering the what and the why. Why?
Well, it was, first of all, it's like the whole thing, I mean, it's so relevant to today, right? So here you got a guy, a center, who's shooting 40, 50% from the line. So he's in the same league as Andre Drummond and, we can just go to Tristan Thompson. We can go down the list of all these guys. And so he switches to underhanded, becomes not a fantastic, but a 70-some-odd% free-throw shooter, like way different. He's no longer a liability from the line. And then he has his greatest game. He scores 100 points, and he goes 28 for 32 from the line, right? And then what does he do? He goes back to shooting it the old way. He would rather be, and the reason he gives in his autobiographies, he says, I didn't want to look like a sissy, which, by the way, is absurd. Who could call Wilt Chamberlain a sissy? The guy is maybe the most masculine human being of all time, right? What I get at in this episode of my podcast, is the third of 10 episodes, is that it's a classic example of how human beings place social considerations ahead of rational considerations. Lots of people in all kinds of situations continue to do stupid things because they care about how they are perceived by their peers more than they care about what it means to be good at what they're doing. So I think doctors do this. I can go down the list of people who do dumb things repeatedly, knowing they're dumb.
Like doctors do that?
Sure. I think doctors are sometimes, I don't mean to pick on doctors, but suppose you're a doctor and you have a choice between doing something the way you've always done it and the way all your peers do, or trying some new potentially transformative treatment that maybe some people will say you're being risky, you're a little bit crazy. You would risk a little bit of your standing in your community if you took a chance.
Yes.
Well, and they would say, I don't want to take a chance.
Well,
right?
In your podcast, you discuss how everybody should go for it on 4th and 1, but they refuse to do it. Is that similar? Explain that.
Same thing. I mean, look, the evidence is in that teams punt way too much. That I don't say you should punt all the time, but look, on 4th and 1, if you run the numbers, the advantage to your team of going for it is overwhelming. And yet all of these coaches, all of whom are incredibly intelligent, thoughtful people, right? They persist in doing it the old way. Why? Because they don't want to take the social heat of being a pioneer in this area. No one wants to go first. The minute Belichick starts going for it on 4th down every time, then everybody will follow. But nobody wants to go first.
In fact, in your podcast, Malcolm Gladwell, it's called Revisionist History, you also discuss how NFL teams should take a different, and I'm so glad you did this because I believe this, they should take a different approach to the draft, and you've said first-round draft picks aren't that valuable.
Yeah, this is pulling up some research that was done by an incredibly brilliant economist named Richard Thaler. And he just points out, in a salary cap environment, the issue is not whether a first-round player is better than a second-round player. The issue is he better for the money than a second-round player? And the evidence is really overwhelming that second- and third-round players are massively undervalued. In other words, you pay so much less for them, but they're not that much worse than a first-round pick. So you should always trade down. I mean, and I think more and more teams are coming around to that, right? But still, there's a lot of, we saw in the last draft, these teams that are crazily trading up, like giving up tons of assets for first-round picks. There is no data to support the wisdom of that. These are all examples of the same thing. You will never get in trouble with your fans for trading up in the draft, right?
Yeah, years ago, Malcolm, Mark Warkentine, who's a longtime NBA management guy, he told me that a lot of times if it's between a European player that the owner's never seen and a kid that was good in the Final 8 or the Elite 8, you would, just to protect your own butt, you would take the domestic player who was on CBS during March Madness, because if he busts, the owner's like, well, I thought he was good too. The European player, even if he's slightly better, but we have very little tape. So to your point, we are consumed often by being able to make our mortgage payment and societal heat. You know, you what do you make of Steph Curry? You added the word outlier to a large degree to our vocabulary. This year, he 400 3-pointers. He broke his record of 286. What do you make of not the modification, the surge of 3-point shooting in the NBA?
Well, I think what we're discovering is that the contribution of practice, deliberate practice, to long-distance shooting on a basketball court is greater than we thought. In other words, I think if you went back a generation and you asked what makes a great outside shooter, people would say a lot of practice, but there's a huge chunk of, we used to talk about natural shooters, and that there was something special and different about some person with a great outside shot. I think what's going on now is that, players are discovering that if they simply apply time and effort and discipline to practicing their shot, they can shoot with far greater accuracy and at far greater depth than they had imagined. I mean, and that's what Steph and Klay Thompson are showing us, right? Which is, you're totally serious and committed to that shot. You can make it work at a level that people hadn't imagined. Now, do I think everyone can be as good as Steph Curry? No way. But I think that there are a lot of 25% free-throw shooters out there, 3-point shooters out there who could be 30 or 35%. Absolutely.
Malcolm Gladwell, 5 New York Times bestsellers. You've read many of them, Tipping Point, Blank, Outliers. You talk a lot about youth sports in your books and how kids can get advantages at an early age. I'm not the helicopter parent with this stuff. My kids are reasonably athletic, but if you were going to give one kernel of advice to a parent who wants their kid to excel at sports, would there be one?
Yeah. Until they're in their mid-teens, have them play as many sports as possible. Don't try and go all in on one sport at an early age. Because you don't know until a child is in his or her teens, you don't know what their best sport is. You're just guessing, right? And the second thing is that there is so much cross-disciplinary advantages in sports. You ultimately can learn so much about how to be an effective basketball player from playing soccer, or how to be a great tennis player from playing basketball. I mean, I could go down the list. How to be a great wide receiver from being playing basketball. I mean, there's a ton of this kind of, when you're building a base of athletic skills, the base should be as wide as possible. And then you specialize once you build that foundation. But if you start specializing at 7, you've got no foundation, right? I mean,
it is also, Malcolm, I could argue, it is the repetition at 9, 10, 11, 12, and the human body in these 12 through 14 years of age is not ready for repetition of the same elbow muscle, the same shoulder muscle.
I absolutely agree with you. I mean, I'm a big runner. You see this with running. You cannot, first of all, can't tell who's a good runner until they're 14, 15, 16, but also it's crazy to train in any kind of focused way until you're in your mid-teens. You're just not mature enough.
Malcolm Gladwell, It's Revisionist History is his podcast. I strongly encourage you to go. He drops by 2 or 3 times a year. You are always welcome. You make me and the audience smarter, and continued success. Revisionist History podcast. The Wilt Chamberlain one just cracks me up. It is so you, and it's so spot on, and thank you for coming on today.
It's a delight, Colin. Thanks a lot.
You bet. Malcolm Gladwell.